Welcome everybody. We got another great episode for you here today. I have a guest with me today that I met actually at the AFP conference last month, the Association for Financial Professionals, for those of you that have not been or are not aware of it. Andrew Childress is an FP&A solutions consultant at Datarails, but he has a varied background in FP&A, accounting. He's got some interesting interests as well that I want to talk about that I think can kind of fill in the blanks and kind of give you some context to his background. But with that, Andrew, if you would give us a little bit more of your background on what you think are kind of the high points that you would want the audience to know about you.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Really glad to be here. Really nice to have met you about a month ago at AFP. And yeah, look, I spent about 10 years in accounting and finance. I started off in accounting at a Fortune 500 company. Before I even knew what FP&A was, I had picked a major and wound up with both a bachelor's and master's of accounting. But by the time I got into my career, I kind of started to see that there was this other thing that I was watching people do and then thinking to myself, I really think that job might be a better fit for me. So I got the opportunity, a few years into my career to move over into an FP&A role, which was really where I really began to love my career and see kind of what FP&A can do for people. And after a while, decided to jump and take some other opportunities, went to some private equity backed ventures. And yeah, I got the opportunity to just continue to cover more ground and have a lot more executive team contact, which is really a good experience for me. And then about a year ago, decided to pivot my career again, which was to move over to the tool side of things and the opportunity to meet finance leaders every day to help them with kind of the challenges they have. And that really brings me to the present, working for Datarails, where I work as a solutions consultant, showing people the product and talking about how we can help.
So it's interesting as you were kind of telling your story, I was seeing a lot of parallels in my background that I don't really talk about a lot because it was so long ago, but I started in public accounting and transitioned over to M&A and then into FP&A, which back then we just called planning. FP&A wasn't really a term, 20 some 30 years ago. I'm obviously a little older than you are, but got into FP&A and realized, wow, I found so much more fulfillment in analyzing stuff and developing insights with the kind of the sole mindset of how do I help senior management make decisions that can move the business forward rather than just reporting on history, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's obviously something that has huge value. We have to have those historicals to do the analysis that we do. But I just personally, everybody kind of finds their groove. But it sounds like you and I kind of have a few similarities there. And actually, when I first started out consulting, it was on the solution side. When I worked at AutoNation, the whole division I worked in got shut down and I got laid off with 400 some other people. And I got hired back on an IT project of all things. And it was basically helping CFOs at remote locations implement sort of an in-between middleware app to report daily data back to headquarters. So
It's really interesting. The first company I worked at, they had a really interesting accounting group. And to this day, I think really we had some best in class processes that I really look back on and drew inspiration on through my career. But we actually had a group that we called functional accounting. And the whole purpose of that group was to be like an accounting business partner to the functions of the business. So I came in and had, I believe, HR and IT in the beginning. And I probably never told this story, but probably one of the first couple of weeks, I was probably 22 at the time. My phone rings and it's the head of HR. And I just got into this role and she asked me, we've been getting these reports. I think it's time we redesign these. And I, not knowing what to say, just kind of say, yeah, I'd love to come in and see how we can help. Hang the phone up. She sent an email to my boss and several others. And it wasn't long before my boss walked over and said, did you just commit to redoing all the reports that we're sending out? And I felt that no wasn't the right answer in that case. So yes was, and that was the beginning of really doing that. But all kidding aside, I mean, that was what I loved about that role. And there was a strong connection to building that FP&A mindset because my business partners were the head of HR. They were the head of IT, and getting a chance to work with them, explain their budget, give them that reporting package every month. That was really that partnership mindset that I grew early in my career that really has guided me the whole time.
yeah, it's really it's an interesting area of finance that I think if more people got exposure to it, FP&A would have a really easy time recruiting people. But some people they just don't have the exposure to it. So I want to ask you a few questions before we roll into some other stuff here. One of the first ones that I was curious about is, what is something I'm always fascinated by contrarian views, because I consider
Mhm.
myself kind of open-minded, but at the same time, a little bit stubborn, right? So I'm kind of curious, do you have any views that you have on the use of visuals in FP&A that most people would consider contrarian?
Yeah, and I enjoy the contrarian thinking too, as anyone who's worked with me or is friends with me will certainly tell you. But I think one for me is that the visual should be the thing that you figure out last. I think there's such a temptation at times to, when you come into a role, want to crank out a new dashboard, want to crank out new charts and graphs that wow somebody. And you may get that wow factor, but at the end of the day, if it's not being built up with good, insightful data backing it, then the charts and graphs really don't do anything for you, right? So I'm a big believer that really the beginning part of a role in FP&A, you really need to make sure that you have the data in order. I don't think that's a contrarian view, but I think the contrarian part is really do that charting and graphing and visualization step at the end of your ramp up in a role.
That's great advice that I wish I would have thought about early on when I started doing presentations, because being a primarily visual thinker, I would always get like a visual in my head, and I would start with that in a slide and work my way backwards. And then I would realize I would get to the end of the presentation and go, this doesn't all tie together because I kind of started it backwards, right? But that was just, I was just kind of following the way my brain naturally worked, which it's good to know how your brain naturally works, but it's not always the most effective way.
Right.
So, what is something actionable that you could suggest to FP&A professionals to think about implementing related to the use of structure in preparing reports, presentations, analysis, any of that stuff? Because I feel really strongly, especially for myself, structure in my work is sort of a cornerstone for me.
It's a great way of thinking about it because I used to think I have a creative streak as well. I used to think that structure stood in the way of being creative, but in reality, structure is that foundation that you use so that you can be creative. If I take care of and automate as much as possible, then I can build a lot of interesting and creative things on top of it. So whatever your process is, the consistency of it is key. So for me, in a lot of my financial models and workbooks and such, I'll use a color coding scheme that consistently colors and labels my tabs where the inputs live, where, the backing data lives, where the outputs live. It's really that discipline and that structure that you have that can really free you up to do, as I always say, more of the fun stuff. Because if I spend all my time, I want to reduce the tax and the cognitive load of every single thing I'm doing, right? So that if I give myself enough headspace, I can really focus on throwing my brain power at the stuff that matters.
Yeah, it reminds me, I saw a post on LinkedIn today where someone was kind of hating a little on AI, basically saying that, AI is not going to replace FP&A professionals because it's our insights that makes us valuable. And my thought on it was, which I expressed in a comment, was I agree with all of that. Our insights is where we bring the value. And AI today is not that great with insights that require a lot of context, but it's brand new. It's like a little toddler, and it's learning and it's getting better every day. And I don't know about you, but hopefully we'll talk about this a little bit later. I use AI every day in lots of different things that I do. And what I've realized is that it's the garbage in, garbage out. If I ask it lousy questions, right? If I have a lousy structure for the work that I'm doing, then I'm going to get lousy output. So that structure, how do I structure the questions? How do I structure my processes? It's the input. That's a big thing.
Yeah. AI is a thought partner to me in most things I do as well. It's not, I think people need to not see it as an either or. We either use AI for something or we do it ourselves, but thinking about that as a collaborative effort really can kind of change your mindset about it.
Yeah, and you said something too that made me think about. I actually think about. I'm trying to think of things I can offload to AI that take the cognitive load off of me for some of these little tasks that are repetitive, and they take up space in my brain, not because they're complicated, but because they're voluminous. There's lots of them. So if I can get it to do a lot of the sort of grunt work for me, that kind of frees up my brain space to go, okay, now I can sit back, I can kind of ideate, I can analyze, I can look at output, and I can apply that context that I have from all those years of experience, kind of apply that to develop those insights. So speaking of context, what are your thoughts about the importance of the use of context in FP&A? I just mentioned in like developing insights, but I feel like context is important in just about everything. But what are your thoughts on an FP&A, how it applies?
One thing I think I'm guilty of at times when I'm working in FP&A roles is, and we are all analytical in this line of work. That's CA after all. We can get very myopic about that thing we're looking at, that thing we're analyzing, that thing we are a mile down the rabbit hole with understanding, right? And sometimes we get really excited about those things and we take it to someone and we say, look, there's this thing and we need to tweak this. We need to change our pricing here. And we lose the entirety of the context of why it matters, right? And if we don't take someone, one of our business partners, one of our leaders on that journey with us about why something matters, then we oftentimes will not be able to really connect with them about why we think that thing that's important is important to us. And so I think creating the context as you communicate your ideas is just like one of the most important skills.
Yeah, that's a great point. The whole it reminds me of it's kind of sales centric, but that concept of WIIFM, what's in it for me, and kind
Right.
of putting your hat on and saying, what's in it for them, right? I'm trying to
Right.
work with this person either as a business partner or serving a stakeholder or serving up some analysis to help people make decisions. And it's about them. It's about what decisions are they trying to make? What's their perspective on this? What are their goals? As opposed to me serving up something that I think maybe a really cool looking visualization, but it doesn't really speak to what they're most focused on.
Yeah,
Um,
John, I think empathy is probably the most underrated skill for someone who works in FP&A. I really think that the ability to put yourself in your business partner's shoes and understand like what they care about, why they care about it, what their incentives are, financial and non-financial. When you really understand those things that are at play and you empathize with the people you work with, you're going to drive the right things for them.
yeah. And so I talk about empathy a lot. I'm glad you brought it up because I always try to remind people, especially in a work environment, when we're talking about empathy, we're not talking about sympathy. It's not about feeling what they feel. It's about understanding where they're coming from so that you can better communicate and better work with them. I don't have to, it doesn't mean agreeance. I don't have to agree with them. But if I really want to communicate and really want to work well with them, I have to understand where they're coming from. What are their goals? What are their problems? And how can we work together on this? So when it comes to technology, we touched on AI a little bit, but I know today, I mean, shoot, I started my first FP&A job was almost 30 years ago, right? And Excel was it. That's all we had, that and the general ledger. There were no other tools. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on suggestions for people, regardless of whether they're small businesses, enterprise level, whatever size organization they're in? What are your thoughts on some of the tools that are available for people in FP&A? And also your thoughts on how should people be looking at tools and what are the questions they should be asking themselves when they're thinking about what tool should I be looking for?
Yeah. So a few thoughts on this. I'll kind of give you a couple big ideas here that I think about. And one of the things I love about working for Datarails is every day just talking to finance leaders about where they're at with the tools they're using, how they use it, what their gaps are. The first is you really can't let a tool be the tail that wags the dog, right? You can't just drop a tool in and say that this is something that we're going to adopt and all of our problems are going to be solved. If you don't have your back office processes worked out and you don't have those processes defined and you've gone through the journey of getting better at them and the work is consistently done, entries are consistently logged, tools will not solve that for you. And no matter what the tool
Yep.
is, no matter how good it is, outdated processes and poorly working processes, there is not a tool good enough to overcome those things. So that's certainly one of them for me. The second is, and this is a big reason that, I'm a big fan of what we do at Datarails is choosing tools that, your team and your business partners will actually adopt is really important. So I've seen and worked in companies where someone comes in and drops in all kinds of dashboards overnight. And we turn on a platform like Power BI or Tableau. And now we've got this dashboard monster with data that's nebulously fed that doesn't tie to some other system that we're using and so on and so forth. So that's really another thing that's important is use the tools that facilitate the way that you want to work. That means,
Yeah.
tying into systems that leverage your ERP data instead of having these other kind of third party sources of data, because the best tool is one you can actually use. And I think that's why it's really important to choose a tool. If you're comfortable in Excel, then you choose a tool like Datarails where Excel is the canvas, right? Those are the things that actually make systems implementation successful in my experience.
Yeah, it's interesting. Years ago, I saw some stat that says something like 80% of IT projects go south because of communications issues. And there was a big project that I worked on, and they were asking us to help them with the reporting, basically make some of the sales reporting easier for the sales team to use, right? Something is more actionable. They gave me these huge conglomeration of Excel files. And I'm looking through all this stuff, and we ask all these questions, and then we sit down and we have a meeting with IT, and we find out they've had a BI tool for years. And nobody used it because when they first bought it, they sent everybody to training. And then over the years, all the people that had been to training had left the company, and nobody had gone to training to learn how to use the new tool. So they're still paying for these licenses for this BI tool that it turns out could do everything they wanted to do and do it really well. But not only did they not know how to use it, the actual end users who would have used it didn't even know it existed because of, how everything panned out. And
And you have
so,
to really, sorry, you have to really match the
yeah,
tool you choose to like where your organization is at. So if you have a huge IT department that can write dashboards and code for you, that's great. Again, like in contrast, like our approach at Datarails is the dashboards are drag and drop, and they use that same set of data that you've piped in from your ERPs and other tools. So really kind of like taking an honest assessment of your company, what your capabilities are, and then choosing, the tools that match. That's really, really crucial.
and you touched on something too, SOPs, right? What kind of changes have you seen in SOPs over the years in different areas from financial reporting to analysis, FP&A software? Because when I think back of my early days, I almost feel like I don't know if I would even be comfortable jumping back into an FP&A team in an enterprise level company like I used to work at, because all the not just the processes and technology, but a lot of the procedures are different. What are your thoughts on what you've seen in changes in SOPs over the years?
I think that they're getting more robust because you know, tech and software is making so much progress in every vertical that you're able to work upstream and get, better outputs and inputs from other systems. So an example is like these days, almost all payrolls platforms have that direct integration with an ERP, right? So now there's a lot less, hopefully for most people, manual payroll accounting. There's something that's getting fired off from a system into the ERP. So when I think about how processes and procedures are different today, I think that technology push in every function of a business now is only a benefactor to finance.
Have you seen something that I'm working a lot more with for my business and for clients that I'm working with is using AI to help not just create the SOPs, but document and communicate the SOPs. Have you seen any companies that you worked with or even the company that you work at using AI in that way with SOPs?
Yeah, I think not so much with AI and SOPs. I don't have as much visibility to those types of things, but AI is certainly finding its way into every product. And I think, for us, we've got now FP&A Genius, which is a chat bot that allows you to chat about your data on top of Datarails to actually, as opposed to putting that into an open large language model where, maybe your data leaks or there's hallucinations about it, it's built on top of your data securely. So I think AI, meeting more and more buyers for whom that is a key question in their RFP process, it's only going to increase. Buyers now are really savvy about saying, what are you doing with AI? Because they're getting asked about it by their leadership teams.
Yeah, I saw, I don't know if you're familiar with Tom Bilyeu, but Tom Bilyeu
Mhm.
was
Yep.
one of the guys that started Quest Nutrition and then had, I think a multi-billion-dollar exit, and now he's got all kinds of other stuff going on. But I saw him in an interview talk about how his policy now with AI is every employee needs to be able to answer the question, either how are you using AI to do your job better and more efficiently? Or why is it that AI can't help you do it better and more efficiently? And if you can't come up with a good answer to those questions, you're going to get replaced because he just kind of feels like it's not coming; it's already here.
I,
It's it's not a question of are we going to use it; it's a question of how we're going to use it. And it's
I
interesting.
think,
This
oh,
Go ahead.
sorry, a lot of that I think comes from, if you're not doing it, your competition is, so you're going to get passed up. And that's why it's so crucial.
Yeah, the whole security issue reminds me of how the cloud was perceived maybe 20 years ago when CTOs were like when adaptive, it used to be adaptive planning. I think is it Workday now? And
Yes. Yep.
yeah, so
Workday
there used to
adapt.
be adaptive planning, then it was adaptive insights. And anyway, it's gone through all these iterations. I remember the early days with adaptive, a lot of the pushback they would get was CTOs who would say, our data is going to the cloud over my cold, dead body, right? Because all those years ago, they didn't trust the security in the cloud. And so people hear AI now and they go, "Oh wait, Chat GPT, that where's my data going?" Just exactly to your point, that's going to be a bump in the road, right? We're going to look back in a few years and people are going to laugh that that was even a concern. Just like now, when people today are like, "Wait, you had to download something? Like, you have on-premises stuff?"
Yeah.
It's just completely flipped around.
Unless you've got a computer sitting in the corner of your house where you run your own email server, you've already trusted a tremendous amount of data to the cloud, for example. And again, all of these companies have, tools and analysis that sit on top. I mean, the ads you get are already happening, and it's not really different with AI, but to the extent you can use tools that kind of segment off and cordon off your data in a way that keeps it private, those are the types of things buyers and savvy users are looking for sure.
I've actually started seeing smaller companies now touting that as a benefit, that your data is private with us. We're not feeding it into Chat GPT, right? This is our own AI, and this is a huge benefit for you for security reasons. And I'm kind of like, yeah, I'm a pretty small company. I'm a solopreneur. I kind of want the 10-ton gorilla right now. I want
Yeah.
the guys that are out in front of the pack that have kind of got most of this stuff, or they at least have the horsepower to figure out the big
Sure.
problems that are going to come. All right, so we talked about some of the tech stuff that I wanted to talk about. I want to throw a couple of questions at you. Are you in Nashville right now?
No, I'm not. So this is a great question. I started an adventure earlier this year in August to actually kind of just fully work remotely. So one great thing about Datarails really embrace remote work for many roles, and so I've been kind of traveling and working remotely from a variety of places. So the last place I lived full time was Nashville, but these days it's kind of renting short term rentals a month at a time and enjoying all that comes
R-
with that.
What gave you that idea? Dude, that sounds like so much fun, but that's very unconventional, or less unconventional than it used to be, I guess. But what got you to think, hey, I want to try this?
Yeah, I think for me, it was really just realizing there were so many places that I hadn't been that I wanted to go check out and see what it would be like to, live and experience that place. But I think as well, I guess one of my life philosophies is this is that, you can go on one or two really good vacations a year. You can have just a workaholic life where you don't do anything, but then a week or two a year, you really cut loose and have a good time. And I think my mindset's really quite different. I think trying to raise your average day as much as possible and make every day as good as it can be. For me, what that meant was exploring and traveling and constantly being in new places. And photography is one of my big hobbies. So the chance to go out and photograph these different places and build up my photo library of the places I stay is just this is really for me at least, this is the life that really makes the most sense and something I enjoy. It's obviously not feasible for everyone, but for me, I feel like it's the perfect fit.
So tell me about your background, because before we started rolling here, you told me a little bit about it, but I think you can make people a little bit jealous. Tell me a little bit about that background and picked it to me.
Yeah, so John, you and I got the chance to meet in San Diego, obviously, and I was looking for a place to go after San Diego, and I happened to notice there were some relatively inexpensive flights from San Diego down to Cabo, so I decided to go check out Cabo for the first time, and this is the marina at Cabo. So this is a photo from my collection just that I shot while I was there. So that was kind of part of the nomad journey as well.
Sweet. Let's go back to Nashville for a second. I've
Yeah.
only been to Nashville a few times, but the last time I was there, the crew that I was with was like, we got to go to Hattie B's. We got to get our hot chicken. Have you tried the shut the cluck up at Hattie B's?
I have. I've had quite a bit of great hot chicken, and there's a place in Nashville. I guess my favorite place is Bolton's, where you can get hot chicken or hot fish. And I'm kind of a big hot fish guy, so that's a
What's the
good
name of
one
it?
too. Bolton's, Boltons, highly recommended.
It is Bolton's. Okay. Is it Bolton's hot chicken or just Bolton's?
I've only ever heard it called Bolton's, but maybe
Bolton's.
maybe
Okay.
there's a bit more to it.
Okay. Cool. Well, maybe we'll have to go there if we both end up going to the AFP conference next year, because that's going to be in Nashville.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking at spending some time out there that month already. And yeah, listen, Nashville's a great city. I grew up in East Tennessee. I would say it's kind of a default for where people move after college. You kind of move to the middle of the state. So a lot of my close friends I grew up with live there. Always, I lived there a little over 2 years, great experience. And I'll tell you, just the local music and everything will just blow you away. The worst music you've heard, somewhere in a bar in the basement in Nashville is the best music you've heard anywhere else. So it's a
Yeah.
pretty unique experience.
Yeah. The time before last that I was there on business. I was doing a seminar and I stayed at a Holiday Inn, just, not a fancy
Yeah.
place, obviously, but it was the Holiday Inn right behind the Vanderbilt Stadium.
Yeah.
And I remember when I checked in, there was already a band playing. And I was like, this is awesome. Like random Holiday Inn. And there's like a house band that was pretty killer. And I still, to this day, I'm scratching my head trying to remember. There was a restaurant across the street that was really good. And I can't remember the name of the darn thing.
Yeah.
I'll figure it out eventually.
It's a funny thing when you're there. If you don't, you meet a lot of people who are really good at what they do that don't work in music, but then you find out they're even better at music than they are at the thing that you see them being really good at. And I'll tell you, there's a brewery out in Nashville. It's a perfect example of this. This guy makes just this incredible aged beer. And I get to talking to him one day and he's telling me, yeah, I'm only ever here when I'm not on tour. And I said, on tour, this isn't your whole thing? And he goes, no, I'm actually Darius Rucker's sound engineer. So as good as
Gee.
he is at that, he's even better at something else. I would say that's kind of Nashville in a nutshell for you.
I feel like a slacker sometimes when I talk to people like that. There's this guy named Scott Rouse who I don't know if he still lives in Nashville. I think he moved, but he lived in Nashville for a long time. He's one of the four guys on this YouTube channel that I love called the Behavior Panel. And what he does for a full-time living is he's a behavior analyst. So he works with like police departments and government agencies, and he helps them with like interrogations and stuff like that. But he's got several Grammy Awards. He was a music producer. And I've heard him tell these oddball stories here and there about this previous life that he had when he was a music producer. I'm like, how is it possible for someone to be top of the food chain at two completely different things that seem totally unrelated? It makes me feel like, man, what am I doing with my life that I haven't gotten to that level?
I think the answer is that there's just these people in the world who have this excellent mindset and they bring it to a
Yeah.
bunch of different domains in their life. And I'm inspired by those people who are really good at multiple things. I'll say for me, I mean, the Excel is kind of my number one thing. Spreadsheets, I've joked before. So spreadsheets are all I've got. There is no plan B, but all kidding aside, I'm inspired by people like that too, because the way that they balance their time and they find a way to be really good at multiple things, I think is just really inspiring.
Yeah, I think my lack of focus has been my downfall because I've dabbled in different martial arts, I've dabbled in music. But when I say dabbled, I mean literally like tried it a handful of times and been like, yeah, this is going to take a lot of dedication to get really good at. And I think there are some things where it took me a long time to learn the lesson. I used to have this mindset of never quit on anything. And I eventually realized it's smart to quit at certain things early.
Mhm.
And I wish I would have done that with a lot of things in the past and just kind of moved on very quickly. But I think I've always had that kind of just sort of gritty, like, I'm not going to quit kind of thing. But it's also been like one of the best things
It's
in
tough to know because on one hand, you press through something that you don't enjoy and you get good at it and you say, that was just the price of admission. And then on the other hand,
yeah.
sometimes you kind of draw things out and then you look back and say, look, I wasted my time. I should have moved on to something that's a better fit. And I think, for me, one of the things I've really tried to cultivate is just following intuition and really trying to listen to myself
Yeah.
about what the difference is between those two. There are some things that it's worth putting your head down and grinding through. And then there's some things that when you're hitting that much resistance, you're getting some feedback signals that you might just not be in the right place at the right time. And I think
Yeah.
the hard part is training yourself to listen to yourself on that.
That's a great point. And actually, that same guy I was talking about, Scott Rouse, he and his partners in crime on that behavior panel they talk about how a lot of the stuff that they do with behavior analysis, every one of us, every human being actually gets the same kind of feelings that these experts get. The difference is the experts have the language to put on it to say, I see this person doing X. That means this, and I know that there's a pattern here, right? And they're developing some insights from that. But because they have the language to explain it and they understand the science behind it, they follow it. Whereas something we call intuition, we don't have the language to put on it, and we can't pin down the logic that's undergirding it. So we
Mhm.
go, I don't know if I should follow this because it doesn't seem logical, but at a visceral level, there's actually a lot more going on that we are perceiving. We just haven't quite connected the dots yet on some of that stuff.
It's the
Um,
gut feeling thing, right? Like on one hand, you can call it a gut feeling, or you can, what you're really saying. I think many times with that is there's like a whole string of logic I can't maybe verbalize, but that does underpin kind of the way I'm feeling about something.
100%. Yeah. And it's just I've gotten to the point now where if I feel an intuition, I'll question it, not in trying to connect the dots and figure out the language to put on it to explain it, but I'll question it enough to say, am I really feeling this thing, or was it just some kind of a bias that's leading me down that path? And if I'm still getting that sort of gut instinct that this is good, this is bad, go left, go right, or whatever it is, then I'll follow it. I will
Yeah.
question it though. I saw you in an interview you did recently. You were on Paul's podcast, and you mentioned something that I've heard a bunch of times. And I'm curious I just kind of want to unpack this a little bit for the audience and get your thoughts on it. And it's that quote from George Box that all models are wrong, but some are useful. In FP&A, good Lord, do we use a lot of models, right? In accounting, we use a lot of models. If you really think about it, accounting is nothing but models, right? There's accounting are man-made rules. They're these mental models that somebody came up with to organize financial information. Tell me a little bit about what your thoughts are on that quote specifically and how you've kind of applied that in FP&A.
It's a great question. And I think, model is actually a relatively nebulous term. And I think that that's really kind of where we should start the discussion is to me, it's a set of inputs and, functions that happen between input and output, all of which are kind of roughly adjustable. Right. And so when I think about that phrase, all models are wrong, some are useful. Maybe this is an odd interpretation of it, but I think of just because you won't land on the perfect answer doesn't mean it's not worth doing the exercise, right? So the first thing I know about every budget I've ever made was it was wrong. The first thing I know about every forecast I made was it was wrong. The point wasn't to get it right. It was to describe a range of scenarios with a range of outputs and moreover how we would react as those played out. Right? So the goal of my forecast wasn't to say I'm going to hit this number on the head. Although the times that did happen, which were few and far between, I certainly felt pretty smug. It was to say, when this does play out, what will we do with it? What if we do beat our revenue forecast by 25%? How will we invest that capital? What if we underrun? What are the things that we need to do? I knew my model was wrong. But could I make it useful so that I could take those ranges of things and then react to it?
Yeah, I've often described investing, forecasting, and planning like gambling. It's just very well informed, very well thought out, very well structured gambling. We're saying, based on what I know, I'm predicting, I'm betting that this is the scenario that we're going to be faced with. And now, based on that, let's figure out if that happens, what do we do about it? And then maybe we run a sensitivity and we've got a bunch of different scenarios. So we have a bunch of different plans. But I've always looked at planning as the plan, exactly to your point, with budgets, forecast plans, all of them. As soon as they're done, they're wrong. But it's not the plan, it's the planning process where the value is. It forces us to ask questions, to poke things and look at them and say, how does this work? What are the real drivers of this number? If I'm going to come up with a planned number, if I'm going to look at it like a driver-based plan, which is kind of what I kind of grew up in driver-based planning,
Yeah.
I have to understand what are the things that drive this number. And so even if my number is wrong, if I go through that process and I ask those questions and I learn and I really get a feel for the business, that's worth being wrong if we've got that learning and that insight from all of that, because that enables us to then be much more nimble and say, oh, okay, I know how this works. Maybe what we should do is tweak this, tweak that, add some input here, tweak a process over here. And it's all from that understanding from the planning process.
And I think there's maybe like 5 phrases we all like to quote as FP&A experts. So the box quote is one of them, but another is the Eisenhower. I believe it's Eisenhower: plans are nothing, planning is everything, which is what you said. And that very art of forcing people to the table to like do a plan together is really, that's the output of it. Like in the beginning of my career, I thought the Excel model I was building was the 5-year plan, but it wasn't. The 5-year plan was the agreement amongst the players in the business on how they were going to drive to who we wanted to be when we grew up, as the saying goes.
Yeah, I wonder too how many people in finance have ever had an epiphany that whatever the thing they were working on, the purpose of that thing they were working on wasn't really what they thought it was. Give me an example, because that probably won't make sense without an example. So when I worked in M&A, I used to work on valuation models for almost all of the deals that we worked on. And in the beginning, I thought, wow, what an awesome responsibility. I have to figure out what we should pay for this company we're going to acquire. Oh, nay, nay. Au contraire, mon frere. Little did I know, it took me a long time to realize that 2 CEOs over some good whiskey at a bar pulled out a napkin and said, well, let's see, what was your cash flow or your EBITDA last year? Let's see, in our industry, it's about 4, 5 times. How about 4.5 times EBITDA, subject to due diligence? Agreed. And now, really, the purpose of my valuation model was to back into that number to justify that number. And the way I learned that was when my boss's boss called down to my office for the first time and said, dude, these EPS numbers in year 3 blow this whole model up. Like, you need to make that X. And I'm like, but we built this thing from the ground up. It was a driver-based model.
Yeah.
What do you want me to change in the assumptions? And then through a series of conversations, realized, oh, the purpose of this thing is not what I thought it was at all, but it's still
Yeah.
important.
This is why technical analysis makes me, it cracks me up. And I have a world of respect for people who are great technical analysts, but you know, all of the sleep lost and the stressing over, EPS numbers and PE ratios and what does the DCF imply and what is the discount rate? It's kind of devoid of how I've actually seen these things work. It can be a guidepost perhaps, but at the same time, I mean, look how many pre-revenue companies go through M&A. I think Facebook paid famously $1 billion for Instagram when they were certainly not profitable. What PE ratio would that fit, right? But it's looked back on as one of the best purchases, one of the best M&A activities of, the last 25 years. And so You can start with a technical analysis. I'm not downplaying its importance, but there's a lot of the storytelling, soft skills not even the right word, but the storytelling and the bigger opportunity that exists on why 1 + 1 = 3 in M&A.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of you guys have on your website a capital asset pricing model template, right? And you mentioned discount rate. I remember one day having a conversation, like our whole team was sitting around and we were literally arguing about the discount rate we were going to use in the discounted cash flow model. And it went round and round, and everybody's explaining their justification for why theirs should be the right one. And at one point, one of my bosses stood up and he goes, "Guys, we're doing a bunch of mental masturbation." He said, "At the end of the day, we know we need to come to a certain number. Let's just make it work." Right? This is all kind of, it's almost like a bunch of finance nerds pontificating, right? It really has no impact on the end goal. It was interesting and it was actually mentally stimulating for a bunch of finance nerds. But at the end of the day, it was kind of almost a useless conversation.
And the best M&A is like the strategic ones, right? Where, they've got something we don't have, we've got something they don't have. Again, that doesn't necessarily show up in a discount rate, right? But it does show up when, look, they make all these products that are targeted at this market segment. We already have a great go-to-market plan that goes into that market segment. We'll be able to bolt on their products and offer them to our existing customers. That just doesn't show up in those types of highly technical analyses. And I do think M&A finance is where, like, a lot of times a lot more of a business partnering mindset's really needed, because it helps you see that bigger portfolio of ideas of why an acquisition could make sense.
Yeah, I think it really matters what the end goal is for the M&A, right? So many years ago, I worked at Blockbuster when we were growing like wildfire. And we were growing from buying mom and pop video stores and just rolling them up. We'd buy the store, and a couple days later, they'd have a Blockbuster sign out front. We'd change all their SOPs, and the profits would go up, and we had the brand and all that good stuff. But then we did some of the bigger, more strategic deals where it wasn't about just adding more locations. It was, let's get into music, let's get into producing movies, let's get into distribution, things that were completely outside of the core business. Where, to your point that you were just making, yeah, now it is a lot more about the business partnering and the synergies and how does all that stuff work, where just the raw numbers don't tell the whole story.
Yeah. I'll bet those mom and pop video stores didn't care much for PE ratios when you were telling them what their store was worth, right?
Most of them didn't understand valuation. And we didn't pay cash for anything back then. We were buying everything with stock. But what I think made it easy was every deal looked the same for the small mom and pop stores. The deal was pretty simple. We're not going to give you a bag of cash, but we're going to give you a boatload of stock. And then we do the dog and pony show on what the stock's done and the track record of the senior management. We sell them on the dream that this thing's going to the moon, right? Just hit your little red wagon to us and you're golden. And oh, by the way, we're going to buy your store, then turn around and hire you back as the GM of this store with a 6-figure salary, like 30 years ago, really good money. And you're going to have a contract. So you're going to make probably close to what you were making before. Plus you got a bunch of stock. Plus now you're part of this bigger, it was like this whole, so
Yeah.
to them, for a lot of them, unless they just loved running a video store, it was a really good deal.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. That's really compelling.
But that leads me to something that I'm curious to get your thoughts on. So you touched on something that reminded me about just decision making in general. And I like to use Blockbuster actually as an example because I forget what the year was, but Google had the opportunity to buy Blockbuster at one point and passed on it. Blockbuster had the opportunity to buy Netflix at one point for just a few $1,000,000, and they literally laughed the Netflix guys out of the room, right? And now, of course, they've gone the way of dinosaurs, Blockbuster has. And it makes me think about, there's a book that I read called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. And Annie Duke was a PhD student studying neuroscience, I believe. And then her husband got a job across the country. She took a sabbatical. While she was on sabbatical, her brother, who was a professional poker player, said, you should learn poker. I think you'd be good at it. So he teaches her poker and she becomes this champion poker player, makes millions of dollars at poker, and then decides to write a book called Thinking in Bets because she realized the decision making in poker is not that different from the decision making in business. And the whole book is about thinking about decisions like bets. We have certain information that we have that's known. There's certain information that is unknown, but we know it's out there, right? Like, for example, we might know that there's a price of some good, but we don't know what the price is. And then there's unknown unknowns, right? Something out there, these black swans that we don't know about.
Unknowable.
The unknowable stuff. And I always like to ask people, how do you measure the goodness of a decision? How do you decide that was a good decision or a bad decision? How would you answer that, just out of curiosity?
Well, wow, that's a really deep and philosophical question. I can only give you one answer to the contrary, which is a way of saying I know how not to judge it, which is on just the outcome, right? So I think the biggest trap you can have is always judging what happens. Yeah, the goodness of my decision, I will measure it by how well things turn out. And in fact, that's really not how things work. And my foray into sales has really taught me that you really just have to go through your process and trust how you kind of share the product with the customer, get to know their needs. They might or might not make a decision that aligns with what you hope they will. But if you follow your process enough times and you really follow your craft, then usually things have a way of working out on a long enough timeline. But looking at each individual outcome and torturing yourself with what you should have done instead, I have found that one, it was a very bad habit of mine, both personally and professionally. I think as time goes on, more detaching a little bit of like measuring and judging yourself by the outcome is one of the most important things you can do because luck is a real thing and there are
Yeah.
always unknown unknowns. And if you solely decide who you are based on how those probabilistic things play out, you're going to form the wrong opinion of yourself.
Yeah. Most of the time when I ask that question, especially FP&A folks, I very quickly get results as an answer. And then I'll throw back at them and, this is not my brain coming up with this stuff. I'm not a PhD in this stuff, but Annie Duke talks about this in her book. Think about the example of drunk driving, right? I think any rational person could agree driving while you're drunk, bad idea, right? Bad decision. But if I were to use that logic of judging a decision based on the results, if I got drunk, drove home, got home safely, woke up the next day, got through my hangover and everything was good. Nobody got hurt. Everything was good. You might conclude from that, based on that logic, you made a good decision. But everybody would agree it was a bad decision. So how do we reconcile that, right? And obviously there's a lot more to it. It's a lot more complicated. She wrote a whole book. She's a doggone PhD in this stuff. But the whole point being, before I started reading that book, I never realized I don't really have any good processes for making decisions. And I think if you think about it, and I've asked a lot of people this question, I've been surprised at how many extremely intelligent people have never really given that much thought into how do I make a decision. And it's taken me down a rabbit hole on reading and courses and stuff like that. So
Yeah. And I think this goes back to what we talked about earlier about models, right? So a decision making model, right? I'm going to follow my process of how I think about things. Here's the inputs I'm going to use. Here's the outputs, the range of outputs I'll come to. And again, your mental models, your decision making models are how you can guide that too. And you have to decide what your inputs are. You have to decide what things you're going to consider. Maybe it's counsel from friends and family. Maybe it's, it is any range of that based on the scenario, but following that model can help you approach decision making more, I think, rationally.
yeah, I think one thing that people ignore a lot too is the emotional part of it. Um, and I forget who it was. I was watching a podcast and the guy asking the question lived in Texas and the guest lived in New York. And they got to talking about the cost of living in New York. And the guy started rattling off, how expensive different things were, the tax rates and all this other stuff. And he said, so why don't you move out of New York? And he goes, because it's not worth it to me. He goes, I know it costs me a lot more, but I look at what I pay as the opportunity cost of everything that I get that I enjoy from living in that city. And so
Yep.
if I pay less money to live someplace else, but I don't get that enjoyment, what was the point of me working hard and making a bunch of money, right? Money's just a tool to get certain things, and the things that I want are in this place. And so I try to just kind of swallow hard and ignore it when I have to pay that big tax bill. But you gotta consider those things. They're relevant. Well,
Absolutely.
we're at the top of the hour here, so I want to go ahead and wrap up here. But tell everybody, where is the best place that they can find you?
Yeah, I would say I'm always open to connections on LinkedIn. I post from time to time. Obviously, I stay pretty busy with a lot of my activities, but definitely feel free to shoot me a connection on LinkedIn. Always happy to chat or just shoot the breeze about all topics FP&A.
Awesome. Well, I want to go ahead and wrap up with that and just remind everybody, remember, communication is about more than words. And we'll see you next time.